It begins with a sound, the flat, steady tone of a heart monitor, the distant, urgent voice of a doctor calling out a time of death. For the person on the table, this is the end of everything. And yet, for thousands of them, it is the beginning of a story they were never supposed to be able to tell. It's a story that starts with a painless, floating sensation, a sudden detachment from the body below, watching with a strange calm as doctors and nurses try to reverse the irreversible. They see the frantic activity, they hear the conversations, they observe details later proven to be impossibly accurate. How could a man, clinically dead from a heart attack, know that his daughter was praying in a different room, wearing a specific blue sweater? How could a woman with no brain activity describe the unique surgical instrument a doctor used only after she had flatlined? For centuries, these accounts were dismissed. They were whispers from the edge of reality, explained away as hallucinations from a brain starved of oxygen, a final cascade of chemicals in a dying mind. They were private anomalies, strange dreams not to be spoken of too loudly, until one man, a philosopher trained to dissect arguments and a physician trained to dissect bodies, decided to do what science had refused to do. He decided to listen, not to one story, but to hundreds. He wasn't just collecting anecdotes, he was gathering evidence. He was treating the impossible as a clue, and the witnesses not as patients, but as the sole survivors of a journey to an undiscovered country. This case doesn't just suggest the brain isn't the source of consciousness, it presents the evidence that the soul might be put on trial. The great exploration of what lies beyond the veil began here, not in a temple, but in a hospital, not with a prophet, but with an investigator. The investigator who opened this case was not a man looking for ghosts. His name was Raymond Moody, and he was by training and by temperament a skeptic. He was a physician grounded in the hard realities of biology, chemistry, and clinical death. He understood what happens when the heart stops, when the lungs fail, and when the brain's electrical signals cease. Death was a biological full stop, an event to be measured and recorded, not a doorway to be opened. But Dr. Moody was also a philosopher, a mind forged in the rigorous logic of Plato, trained to dismantle arguments, identify fallacies, and follow a chain of reason to its absolute conclusion. He approached the world not with faith, but with questions. He believed, like the entire scientific establishment, that these near-death experiences were simply tricks of a dying brain, a final, meaningless light show caused by a lack of oxygen or a flood of endorphins. It was the neatest, most logical explanation. And it was completely wrong. The first crack in his materialistic worldview appeared not in a hospital, but in a university classroom. A respected older professor casually recounted his own NDE, describing the journey out of his body with such clarity and intellectual honesty that it struck Moody not as a fantasy, but as a piece of data that didn't fit. One piece of data can be an anomaly, but then came another and another. A patient here, a colleague's story there, whispers that started to form a chorus. He realized he was no longer hearing isolated stories. He was hearing a single, consistent testimony from witnesses who had crossed the threshold of death and returned. So, he did what any good detective would do. He opened a file. Inside Raymond Moody, two powerful forces were at war. The physician, a man of empirical data, of charts and brainwaves, demanded a rational, biological explanation for these stories. He was the guardian of the known world, and his world was built on the unshakable foundation that when the brain dies, the person is extinguished. But the philosopher in him had a different loyalty. His loyalty was not to a comfortable answer, but to the integrity of the question itself. The philosopher knew that to dismiss a consistent pattern of evidence without a thorough investigation is not science, it is dogma. It is the very intellectual laziness that his philosophical training had armed him to fight. The physician saw patients with strange stories. The philosopher saw independent witnesses describing the same impossible event. And so, in the quiet hours after his clinical work was done, Moody began a second, more secret kind of work. He wasn't just opening a file, he was beginning a clandestine investigation, not into a crime, but into a phenomenon that the paradigm of his time had already declared impossible. He wasn't searching for proof of heaven or trying to start a religion. He was simply honoring the first rule of any honest investigator. You do not ignore the witnesses, especially when they all start telling you the same story. As Moody's private collection of testimonies grew, from dozens to over 150, He began to lay them out, not like a doctor reviewing patient charts, but like a detective pinning evidence to a wall. He was searching for a pattern, a signature, a common thread that connected these impossible journeys, and what he found was staggering in its consistency. The stories came from different people, different ages, different religious backgrounds, and different medical circumstances. Some were from car accidents, others from heart attacks, others from complications in childbirth, yet the core experience, the sequence of events beyond the point of clinical death, was strikingly similar. Moody isolated the common elements, the recurring waypoints on this journey beyond the veil. It wasn't a vague feeling, it was a structured, repeating sequence of events. First was the overwhelming feeling of peace. The physical pain vanished, replaced by a profound sense of calm and well-being. Second, the distinct sensation of leaving the physical body, a weightless, out-of-body experience, where they could see their own form from a perspective above, a spectator to their own failed resuscitation. Then came the passage, a journey through a dark space, often described as a tunnel, at an incredible speed, moving towards a brilliant, beautiful light. At the end of this passage, they encountered a being of light, not a figure from a specific religion, but a presence radiating an unconditional love and acceptance that was beyond any human experience. This being would then initiate the most profound element of the entire journey, the life review, not a judgment, but a panoramic, instantaneous replay of their entire life. Every action, every word, every thought. But they didn't just see their actions, they experienced the direct emotional consequences of those actions on others. They felt the joy they had caused, and they felt the pain they had inflicted from the other person's perspective. It was the ultimate lesson in empathy and interconnectedness. He had found the pattern, a clear, repeating blueprint of the first stages of the journey after death. This wasn't a collection of random hallucinations. This was a map. The life review that Moody documented was more than just a memory. It was a complete shift in the nature of perception itself. Time, as we know it, had collapsed. Imagine not watching a film of your life, but becoming an ocean where every drop of water is a moment you lived, and you can dive into any one of them instantly, feeling it in its entirety. The witnesses didn't just remember a moment of anger. They became the recipient of that anger, feeling the sting of their own words. They didn't just recall a simple act of kindness. They were flooded with the warmth and gratitude that act generated in another person's heart, amplified 1,000 times. It was a direct, unfiltered perception of cause and effect, the fundamental law of karma, not as a religious concept but as an experiential reality. And alongside this moral clarity came an intellectual one. Witnesses reported being flooded with instantaneous knowledge. Complex questions about the universe, about science, about the nature of reality were answered not in words, but in a sudden, complete understanding. They were shown the intricate, clockwork perfection of the cosmos, the interconnectedness of all things, from the smallest atom to the grandest galaxy. This wasn't just a vision, it was an education. Moody realized that the people returning from this state weren't just describing a light at the end of a tunnel. They were describing a classroom, a place where the curriculum is your own life, and the final lesson is the universal truth that love and knowledge are the very fabric of existence. He wasn't just mapping a journey, he was documenting a curriculum for the soul. The implications of Moody's findings were seismic. They were a direct challenge to the foundational assumption of modern science, the idea that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain, a ghost in the machine. If what these witnesses reported is true, if a person can see, hear, learn and feel with perfect clarity while their brain shows no signs of life, then we are not the machine, we are the ghost. And that ghost is more real, more aware and more alive than the body it temporarily inhabits. This single idea changes everything. It reframes our entire understanding of who we are. We are not just biological creatures living a finite life that ends in oblivion. We are immortal consciousness, having a temporary and profoundly meaningful human experience. This transforms our perception of death from an end into a transition, a doorway, not a wall. It suggests that our greatest fear is based on a misunderstanding of our own nature. But the most earth-shattering implication was not a new discovery, but a rediscovery. As Moody, the philosopher, reviewed the map he had created, he was struck by a chilling echo across time. The out-of-body journey, the passage, the being of light, the life review, the return with newfound knowledge. He had read this before. Over 2,000 years ago, in his foundational text, The Republic, Plato told the story of a soldier named who dies in battle and returns to life 12 days later. Describes his soul leaving his body, journeying to a place of judgment, where he witnesses souls being shown a review of their past lives, and then choosing their next life based on the lessons learned. The parallels were too precise to be a coincidence. Moody realized he hadn't discovered something new. He had found modern clinical evidence for one of the oldest spiritual teachings of humanity. The philosopher who began as a skeptic had inadvertently become the first scientist to provide data that supported Plato's theory of the immortal soul. And the echo didn't stop with Plato. Moody was now standing at the intersection of modern medicine and ancient mysticism. The map he had drawn based on the testimonies of cardiac arrest survivors in the 20th century was, in its essential features, the same map described in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a guide for the soul's journey through the underworld, written over 3,500 years ago. It was the same map outlined in the Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which provides a precise step-by-step manual for the consciousness navigating the luminous and terrifying realms between death and rebirth. Hinduism, Christianity, esoteric Judaism, the spiritual traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide. Once you had the key, you could see it everywhere. The names changed, the symbols varied, but the fundamental stages of the journey remained the same. This was the ultimate implication. The near-death experience wasn't a phenomenon of the modern hospital, it was a universal human experience. Moody's investigation had stumbled upon the empirical proof for what mystics and philosophers have called the perennial wisdom, a single, universal truth about the nature of the soul and its journey, known to every culture, in every age, hidden in plain sight within our most sacred stories. The question was no longer, is there life after death? The question had become, how have we managed to forget what we have always known? Moody's map, as detailed as it was, had a border, a point beyond which all his witnesses, all his returned travelers, fell silent. He had meticulously documented what they saw, what they heard, and what they learned. But when he asked them to describe the ultimate nature of the being of light, or the core essence of the reality they had touched, their stories faltered, their language collapsed. This was the final, and perhaps most consistent element he catalogued: ineffability. The experience was simply beyond the power of human words to contain. Witnesses would struggle for metaphors. They would say it was like trying to describe color to a person born blind. They would use words like the source, the one, or simply home. But these were just labels, faint echoes of a reality so vast, so complex, so saturated with love and intelligence that our minds are simply not built to process it and report back. One witness, after a long, frustrated pause, told Moody, "I know everything. I understand how it all works. The problem is, there are no words in my brain to tell you." This was the limit, the point where the investigation reached the sacred. It suggests that while we may be able to map the journey's beginning, the final destination is an experience so total that you cannot describe it. You can only become it. Moody's evidence didn't just point to the survival of consciousness, it pointed to a final, ineffable mystery that lies at the heart of existence, a truth so profound it can only be known, not told. This silence wasn't a failure of memory. The witnesses recalled every other detail with hyper-vivid clarity. This was different. It was a cognitive barrier, as if they had brought back a piece of information written in a language for which no translation will ever exist. It was a knowledge that arrived not as a sequence of thoughts, but as a single simultaneous download of infinite data. Think of it this way. Our science describes the universe through mathematics, a language of symbols that points to the truth but is not the truth itself. We can write the equation for gravity, but we cannot hand someone the experience of a star collapsing into a black hole. The witnesses had experienced the reality behind the equation. They had merged for a moment with the operating system of the cosmos itself, and when they tried to speak of it, they were faced with a paradox. To describe the source would be like a single wave trying to describe the entire ocean while still being a part of it. The act of describing it creates a separation that, in that state, simply does not exist. There is no you there to observe an it. There is only the all-encompassing is. This ultimate revelation, this boundary of language, was perhaps Moody's most profound clue. It suggested that the final state of consciousness is not something we go to see, like a tourist visiting a new city. It is a state of being that we are subsumed by, a return to a fundamental unity so complete that it renders the individual perspective, and therefore individual description, impossible. In 1975, Raymond Moody published his findings in a slim, sober book titled Life After Life. He did not claim to have proven the existence of an afterlife. He simply presented the evidence, the meticulously documented testimonies of over 150 witnesses. He laid his case file on the table for the world to see. The public reaction was explosive. The book sold millions of copies, tapping into a deep, unspoken question within the human heart. But the reaction from the scientific and medical establishment was swift, predictable, and dismissive. This was the trial. And the verdict from the guardians of the materialist paradigm was clear: guilty of delusion. The explanations came thick and fast. These weren't journeys to another world, they were physiological events. It's a lack of oxygen to the brain, anoxia, some argued. It's the release of endorphins, the body's natural painkiller, creating a sense of euphoria, said others. It's a psychological defense mechanism, a depersonalization to protect the ego from the terror of annihilation. These were tidy, comforting explanations that kept the old worldview intact, but they had one fatal flaw. They could not account for Moody's most powerful evidence. They could not explain veridical perception. How could a lack of oxygen allow a patient, whose eyes were taped shut on an operating table, to correctly identify a small, unnoticed dent on the top of a surgical light fixture? How could a flood of endorphins allow a dying man to accurately describe the frantic conversation his family was having in a waiting room 3 floors below? The most famous of these cases was that of a woman named Pam Reynolds. During a complex brain surgery, she was placed in a state of hypothermic cardiac arrest. Her body temperature was lowered to 60 degrees. Her heartbeat and breathing were stopped. Her brain waves were silent, and the blood was drained from her head. She was, by every clinical definition, dead. Yet she returned with a stunningly accurate account of her own operation. She described the Midas Rex bone saw the surgeon used, a detail she couldn't possibly have known. She even repeated a specific, casual comment a female doctor had made during the procedure. The skeptics' explanations fell apart in the face of these facts. A hallucinating brain cannot gather verifiable new information from the outside world. A dying mind cannot see without eyes, and hear without ears. Moody's case rested on this unshakable point. Either these people were performing a miracle of perception, or the one thing doing the perceiving, their consciousness, was never in the body to begin with. And Moody was no longer a lone voice in the wilderness. At the very same time he was conducting his philosophical investigation, another giant was approaching the same mystery from a completely different direction. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the world-renowned psychiatrist who transformed our understanding of death and dying, had spent decades at the bedsides of thousands of terminally ill patients. She was not asking about near-death experiences. She was simply offering comfort and listening to the dying in their final moments. And they began to tell her things. They spoke of deceased relatives, a mother or a beloved spouse, appearing in the room to comfort them, promising to help them with the transition. These weren't confused ramblings. They were lucid, peaceful, and often transformative experiences for the patient. Kubler-Ross, a scientist of impeccable credentials, began to document these deathbed visions with the same rigor Moody applied to NDEs. She found that, without exception, not a single one of the thousands of dying patients she worked with, including young children, ever described a terrifying or dreadful end. They all described a peaceful process of slipping out of a cocoon. When Moody's book was published, it was a profound confirmation for Kubler-Ross. His beings of light were the same loving figures her patients were describing. His feeling of peace was the same serenity she had witnessed thousands of times. Two of the 20th century's most important researchers on death, working independently, had arrived at the exact same conclusion. Human consciousness is not extinguished at the moment of clinical death. The paradigm wasn't just facing one investigator's evidence anymore. It was facing a convergence of testimony from two unimpeachable sources. To dismiss it now was no longer a scientific stance. It was a willful refusal to look at the data. Raymond Moody did not solve the ultimate mystery of death. What he did was far more important. He gave us permission to ask the question again, but this time armed with evidence. He transformed the conversation from one of blind faith to one of credible, systematic investigation. He took the most profound human experience out of the realm of superstition and placed it firmly on the table of rational inquiry. He was not the man who brought back the final answer from the other side. He was the man who came back with the first credible map, pointing the way for all the explorers who would follow, the physicians, the physicists, the philosophers, and the millions of individuals who now had a framework to understand their own experiences. His work was a quiet revolution, a revolution not of dogma but of perspective. It suggests that our lives are not a brief, accidental flicker of light in a dark, meaningless universe. They are a single, precious chapter in a much grander, immortal story, a story of learning, of growth, and of an eventual return to a source of unimaginable love and light. Now that you have seen this evidence, you cannot unsee it. The file Moody opened is not closed. It remains the most important cold case in the history of humanity. The great exploration of consciousness has only just begun. If this investigation resonates with the questions you've been asking, subscribe to continue the great exploration. This concludes our inquiry for now, a synthesis of documented evidence and timeless philosophical questions, grounded in the sources that guide our journey. What truth did you recognize today?